On a far-off planet, in a small, remote alien settlement, humans and aliens were trying to survive after a terrible accident. The human transport ship, which had been their only way home, was destroyed during a battle with space pirates. Now, they were stranded on an unfamiliar planet with little food and water. The harsh environment made life even harder. Alien and human survivors were forced to work together, but they were still struggling to get along. In the middle of this struggle was Jack, an ordinary human man with a quiet and kind heart. He wasn't the strongest nor the most clever, but he had something most of the others didn't: a deep sense of caring for others. Jack wasn't one to complain, even though he hadn't had a proper meal in days. His stomach growled, his body weak from hunger, but he never let that show. He spent most of his time helping the other survivors, trying to make their lives just a little bit easier. One day, as he sat near the campfire, Jack noticed a group of alien children sitting around, their big eyes filled with sadness. They were hungry, weak from the lack of food, and Jack could see they didn't have much energy left. The settlement had been rationing its food carefully, but the supplies were running out. There was only enough food for a few more days, and no one knew when help would come. Jack's eyes landed on the last of his rationed meal. It wasn't much, just a small piece of bread and some dried meat. But it was all he had left. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him just how empty he felt inside. He knew the other humans were struggling too, but when he saw the children, his heart softened. They needed the food more than he did. Without thinking twice, Jack stood up and walked over to the children. "Here," Jack said quietly, handing the small portion of food to the nearest child. The child's eyes widened in surprise. It was an alien girl, small and thin, with delicate features. She looked at the bread in her hands, then up at Jack, unsure of what to do. Jack smiled gently, nodding toward the other children. The alien girl, Zara, felt a warmth in her chest as she ate the food. She had never seen anything like this before. The humans had always seemed distant, cold even. But this man, this human, had given up his last meal for them, for her, for the children. It wasn't just the food that moved Zara, it was the selflessness. In Jack's eyes, the quiet strength he showed in a world where survival often meant putting yourself first. As the other children finished eating, Zara kept her eyes on Jack. He sat back down, his own hunger forgotten for the moment, watching the stars above. He didn't expect anything in return. He didn't want thanks. He just wanted to make sure they survived another day. That was enough. For him. Zara didn't understand why Jack did this. There was nothing special about him. He wasn't a leader, wasn't anyone of great importance. Yet, to her, he was more than just a man. He was someone who cared. In the days that followed, Zara found herself following Jack around. She watched him help others, whether it was fixing broken equipment or carrying supplies. He wasn't the strongest, and he didn't have the best ideas, but his kindness and actions spoke louder than anything else. He never asked for anything, never expected gratitude. He simply gave. And for Zara, that made him someone worth following. Jack didn't. Notice Zara's growing attachment at first. He was too focused on helping everyone else. But he couldn't deny the feeling that Zara was always nearby, watching him, always offering to help him with small tasks. She started carrying water for him, and whenever Jack was feeling tired or hungry, Zara would bring him whatever she could find. She never said much, but Jack could see the respect in her eyes. He wasn't sure why she looked at him that way, but over time he realized it wasn't just about the food. It wasn't about the small gestures. Zara saw something in him that the others didn't. Jack was beginning to wonder if he was becoming something more to her than just a fellow survivor. But what? He wasn't sure. He didn't feel like a leader. He never asked to be one. One night, As Jack lay awake staring up at the stars, he heard Zara's voice beside him. She had come to sit near the fire, and without a word she sat down beside him. They both stared at the sky in silence for a while. "Why did you do it?" Zara finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost like a whisper. Jack turned his head to look at her. "Do what?" "Give your last meal to us," Zara said, her eyes never leaving his. "Most people would have kept it for themselves." Jack thought for a moment. He wasn't sure what to say. He hadn't really thought about it that much. It was just something he felt he had to do. "I guess. Because you needed it more than I did," Jack said quietly, shrugging as if it was nothing. "I've lived long enough. I wasn't going to let the kids go hungry if I could do something about it." Zara's eyes softened as she looked at him. In that moment, she understood something about Jack that she hadn't before. It wasn't just that he was kind. It was that he was willing to sacrifice everything for the people around him, even if they weren't his own. Jack wasn't just a survivor, he was a protector. And from that moment on, Zara saw him differently. She saw him as someone who could lead them, someone who could bring them hope, even in the darkest of times. Jack may not have been aware of it yet, but didn't mind her presence. In fact, he had grown used to it. Zara wasn't like the other kids. She was quiet, serious, and focused. She never asked for anything in return, but Jack noticed her eyes would often linger on him. She looked at him like he was someone important, someone special. Jack couldn't quite understand why, but he appreciated her help. Zara didn't speak much, but her actions told Jack everything he needed to know. She had stopped seeing him as just a fellow human survivor. Instead, she saw him as someone who could make a difference. Zara had begun telling others about him, about his selflessness, and how he had given up his last meal to help the children. Slowly, the others started to take notice too. Jack hadn't realized it at first, but he was becoming something of a figure to the settlement. Someone who stood out not for his strength or intelligence, but for his heart. One afternoon, while Jack was working on fixing some broken machinery, Zara came to him with a look of determination in her eyes. She wasn't the same shy girl who had once quietly observed him. There was something different about her now, something stronger. Zara walked up to Jack and spoke with a firm voice, unlike anything he had heard from her before. "You need to lead us," she said, standing tall in front of him. "You are the one who can help us survive." Jack stopped what he was doing and looked at her confused. "Lead us?" "I'm not a leader, Zara. I'm just doing what I can to help." But Zara shook her head, her eyes intense. "You don't understand. You've already done more for us than anyone else. You gave us hope when there was none left. You gave your last meal to save the children. You have already shown what true leadership is. We need you to lead us." Jack was taken aback by her words. He didn't feel like a leader. He didn't even think of himself as someone special. He was just a man who had made a simple choice. Yet Zara's words stuck with him. She wasn't the only one who believed in him. Slowly, others in the settlement were beginning to see him in the same way. They saw his actions, his sacrifices, and the way he put others before himself. It wasn't just about food or supplies, it was about something deeper. Jack had become a symbol of hope, even though he hadn't asked for it. That night, as the group sat around the campfire, Jack couldn't help but notice how Zara kept glancing at him. There was a quiet admiration in her eyes, something he couldn't ignore. It wasn't the kind of look someone gives out of pity or gratitude. It was something more. Zara wasn't just grateful for his help. She saw him as their guide, their leader. And that idea started to take root in Jack's mind. Maybe Zara was right. Maybe he had a responsibility to step up, to lead. The thought terrified him, but it also felt right. The next morning, Jack woke up early and went to the central gathering area. It was time to make a decision. He couldn't continue pretending that everything would just work itself out. He had to take control of the situation. The settlement was falling apart, and the rival alien faction led by Tarnok was growing more threatening every day. If they didn't act soon, there was a real chance they could lose everything. Jack couldn't let that happen, not after everything they had been through. Zara found him there, sitting on a broken stone wall, looking out over the settlement. She approached him cautiously, as if she knew something had changed. Jack turned to her, his face serious. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady. "You're right. I can't just sit back anymore. If I'm going to help, I need to take charge. But I don't know what to do. I'm just one person." Zara nodded, her expression unwavering. "You're not just one person. You've already shown that you can do more than anyone else here. People trust you. They believe in you?" Jack sighed, looking down at his hands. He didn't feel like he was anything special. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe Zara had seen something he hadn't. Maybe this was his chance to do something bigger, to protect the people who depended on him. He stood up, determination in his eyes. "All right, let's figure out a plan. We'll take whatever we have left and use it to defend the settlement. If we don't, Tarnok's faction will take everything from us." Zara's face lit up with relief. She had known Jack would come around, even if I didn't realize it yet. "We'll stand by you," she said firmly. "You're our leader now, Jack." For the first time, Jack felt the weight of those words. He wasn't sure he was ready for the responsibility, but one thing was clear. He couldn't back down now. He had to lead. And with Zara by his side, and the support of the other survivors, Jack knew he would find a way to protect them. As the days passed, Jack worked with Zara and the others to prepare for the looming threat. They made plans, gathered what little supplies they could, and prepared the settlement for whatever Tarnok's faction might throw at them. Jack's confidence grew, not because he had all the answers, but because he knew he was no longer alone. Zara's belief in him, and the trust of the others, gave him the strength he needed to keep moving forward. The settlement was tense. The wind blew dust across the dry, barren land as the survivors worked together to prepare for the coming threat. Jack could feel the weight of the responsibility resting heavily on his shoulders. He had never been in charge of anything before, but now the survival of the entire group seemed to depend on the decisions he made. Zara stayed close, as always, her presence a quiet reminder of the belief she had in him. It was a weight he couldn't ignore, but it was also a motivation. He had talks to him, her posture straight and her gaze unwavering. She believed in him completely, and somehow that belief made him feel stronger. The group worked together, setting up the decoys and preparing the traps around the settlement. Jack kept his focus, checking every detail, making sure nothing was overlooked. The tension was thick in the air as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land. Zara moved quietly among the children, giving them comforting words, and making sure they were ready to take shelter if things went wrong. Jack knew that their survival depended on their ability to stay calm and organized. Everyone had to do their part. Night fell, and the group took their positions. Jack stood at the edge of the settlement, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. His heart raced as he thought about what would happen if the plan failed, but he pushed the fear aside. He couldn't afford to think about failure now. He had to believe in the plan. He had to believe in the people around him. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder. Jack's eyes narrowed, and he signaled to Zara, who nodded and moved into position. The rival faction was approaching. Tarnik and his group were here. Jack's hand tightened around the weapon he had been given, though he had no experience with it. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a fighter, but he was a protector, and that was enough. Zara was beside him, her face calm, her eyes alert. She didn't look afraid. In fact, she looked determined. Jack realized then that he wasn't the only one leading the group. Zara had become a leader in her own right, guiding the children and helping everyone stay focused. She had grown into someone he could rely on, and that gave him confidence. The decoys they had set up were working. Tarnok's group was confused, walking into traps they didn't expect. Jack could see the frustration on Tarnok's face as he realized they had been outsmarted. But the situation was still dangerous. Jack knew Tarnok would not back down without a fight. He had no choice but to face them head-on. Tarnok finally stepped into view, his imposing figure towering over the others. He looked angry, his sharp eyes scanning the settlement. "You think you can outwit me, human?" Tarnok's voice boomed, filled with rage. "I'll take everything you have!" Jack stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "No," he said, his voice steady despite the fear inside him. "You won't. This settlement belongs to us, and we're not giving it up," Tarnok sneered. "You're nothing but a weak human. You think you can stop me with these pathetic tricks?" Jack didn't respond. He couldn't waste time on words. He had to make Tarnok see reason. Jack signaled to Zara, and without a word she moved quickly, heading to the underground shelters where the children were hidden. The rest of the group watched in silence as the standoff continued. Jack stood firm, knowing that this was the moment everything would change. Tarnok raised his weapon, clearly ready to fight. But before he could make a move, Jack spoke again. "We don't want violence," Jack said. "We want peace. We want to survive. You can take what you need, but leave us to rebuild. There's no need for this to go any further." Tarnok hesitated. His eyes flickered with something like doubt, but then his anger flared again. "I'll never trust a human, you're all the same." At that moment, Zara returned with the children, standing behind Jack. Her presence was powerful, like a silent force that gave him strength. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. She trusted Jack, and that was enough. Jack took a deep breath and made one final plea. "I'm not asking you to trust us," he said. "I'm asking you to walk away. We don't want to fight, but we'll do what it takes to protect our home." The silence stretched on, heavy and thick. Tarnok's hand lowered slightly, but he didn't let go of his weapon. Jack knew the situation was fragile, and it could turn at any moment. But he stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "I'll let you leave, Tarnok," Jack said, his words clear and strong. "But if you try to take more than what's fair, we will fight." Tarnok stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the two of them locked eyes. Then, without a word, Tarnok turned and signaled to his group. They slowly began to retreat, their weapons still at the ready but no longer aimed at Jack. Jack exhaled slowly, his body still tense with adrenaline. The group had won. The challenges of surviving on this unfamiliar planet were far from over. Jack felt the weight of it all. As the leader of this small group, he now had to face the responsibility that came with the role. It wasn't just about protecting them from outside threats anymore. It was about making sure they had the strength and resources to build a future. They needed food, water, and a place where they could start again. The settlement had no permanent structures, and their supplies were running low. If they didn't find a way to adapt, they wouldn't survive the next few months. Zara was always by his side, her quiet confidence never wavering. Over the past few days, Jack had come to realize just how much Zara had grown. She was no longer the shy girl who had watched him give up his meal for the children. She had become a leader in her own right. She took care of the children, ensured everyone had a task, and helped to organize the group. Zara had a way of making others feel calm, like everything would be okay as long as they worked together. One morning, Jack sat down with Zara to discuss their next steps. They needed to find food. The settlement's food supplies were almost gone, and no one had the energy to go searching without some kind of plan. The two of them sat near the campfire, the faint glow of the fire illuminating their tired faces. "We need to explore beyond the settlement," Jack said, his voice serious. We don't know what's out there, but we have to take the risk. We can't wait for supplies to come to us. Zara nodded, her eyes thoughtful. I agree. We've been relying on what little we have for too long. There must be something in the land we can use. We can't just sit here and wait for something to happen. We need to act. Jack looked at Zara, admiring her calm but determined demeanor. She had a way of thinking clearly, even in the most difficult situations. He knew that, if they were going to survive, they would need to stick together and trust each other completely. Zara had proven she was someone he could count on. They spent the next few days preparing for the journey. They gathered what little equipment they had, simple tools for gathering food, a few weapons for protection, and the most basic of supplies. Zara helped organize the children and the others, making sure that everyone understood their roles, while Jack focused on planning the route. When the day finally came to leave, Jack and Zara led a small group toward the unknown wilderness beyond the settlement. The rest of the survivors stayed behind, guarding the settlement and keeping the children safe. Jack wasn't sure what they would find, but he knew they had no choice but to try. Their lives depended on it. The journey was tough. The land was harsh, and the air was dry and thin. The further they went, the more isolated they became from the settlement. The plants and animals in the area were unlike anything Jack had ever seen. Some looked harmless, while others seemed dangerous. They stayed alert, knowing that any wrong step could lead to disaster. Zara, ever watchful, kept the group moving carefully and quietly, scanning the landscape for any signs of danger. After several days of traveling, the group found something that gave them hope. In a narrow valley, they discovered a river. It wasn't much, but it was fresh water, something they had been without for weeks. The sight of it brought a wave of relief, and the group wasted no time setting up camp nearby. Zara carefully examined the plants growing along the riverbank, and to her surprise, many of them were edible. They hadn't expected to find anything so valuable so soon, and the discovery filled them all with renewed energy. They spent the next few days exploring the area around the river. They found more plants they could eat, and even some that could be used for medicinal purposes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive. Jack felt a sense of accomplishment as he saw the group working together, gathering what they could and preparing for the journey back. They had found something that could sustain them for a while longer, and that was all they needed for now. As they prepared to return to the settlement, Jack couldn't help but think about how far they had come. Just a few weeks ago, they had been strangers in a strange land, fighting for survival with no plan and no hope. Now they had food, water, and a chance to rebuild. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Jack realized that despite all the challenges they had faced, they had learned to depend on each other. They had formed something stronger than a group of survivors. They had formed a community. Zara stood beside him, looking out over the land they had explored. She didn't say anything, but Jack could feel the strength of her presence. They had done it together. They had survived together, and that more than anything gave him hope. The journey back to the settlement was long, but it felt different this time. They had a purpose now. They had something to return to. When they arrived, the others were waiting for them, eager to hear about what they had found. Jack and Zara shared the news of the river and the edible plants, and the group celebrated the success. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. That night, as the stars filled the sky above, Jack sat with Zara by the campfire, thinking about the future. They still had a long way to go. There would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time since they had arrived on the planet, Jack felt like they were on the right path. They had hope again. They had each other. And as long as they had that, they could face whatever came next. The days following their return to the settlement were filled with hard work, but there was a new sense of optimism in the air. Jack felt it every time he looked around. The group, had something they hadn't had before, a plan. They now had food and water and a place to gather resources. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going. Every day, more people joined in the effort, working to strengthen their home and prepare for whatever came next. The mood was more hopeful, though Jack knew they weren't out of danger yet. Despite the small victories, Jack couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the future was uncertain. They had found water, but Tarnok's faction was still a threat. While they had successfully driven them back before, Jack knew that they would return if they saw the settlement growing stronger. They needed more protection. They needed something, more than just basic survival. They needed to be able to defend themselves. One evening, as Jack sat by the fire, thinking about their next steps, Zara came to sit beside him. She was always by his side now, not as a follower, but as an equal, and Jack could see the strength in her. The leadership she had shown, especially with the children, had helped keep the group united. She had become someone the others looked to, just like him. Jack couldn't deny that, in a way, he relied on her as much as she relied on him. "We need to start training," Zara said quietly, her voice steady and serious. "We've only just begun to defend ourselves, and we can't afford to wait until it's too late." Jack nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. We need to be ready. If Tarnok comes back, we won't have the element of surprise this time." The idea of training wasn't something Jack had considered before. The thought of teaching others to defend themselves felt strange. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't even sure where to begin. But Zara's confidence made him feel like it was possible. She had always known what to do, and in many ways, she had been leading them all along. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn from her. The following days were filled with planning. Jack and Zara worked together to figure out the best way to teach the group to protect themselves. They started simple, showing everyone how to use the tools they had scavenged from the wreckage of their ship and the surrounding area. They didn't have much, but what they did have could be used to their advantage. They used old pipes, scraps of metal, and whatever else they could find to make makeshift weapons. Zara led the children in one area, teaching them to be alert and focused. Jack worked with the adults, showing them how to defend their shelter, how to set traps, and how to recognize signs of danger. Every day, they practiced. It wasn't easy, and the group struggled at first. But over time, Jack saw changes. People were more confident, more focused. They were learning, growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, as they were practicing their defense drills, a sharp, sudden noise echoed through the settlement. Everyone froze, eyes wide with fear. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the source of the sound. It was a distant noise, but it was enough to send a ripple of panic through the group. Zara was already moving, her eyes scanning the area, alert and calm. "It's not Tarnok," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "But we need to be ready. Stay focused." Jack nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He wasn't sure what the noise was, but Zara was right. They couldn't let fear take over. The settlement was growing stronger, but they needed to stay vigilant. They needed to be ready for whatever came next. For the next few hours, the group stayed alert, watching the perimeter of the settlement and listening carefully for any other signs of danger. The noise had stopped, and after a long wait, Jack began to relax. Maybe it had been nothing, but the tension still lingered in the air. Everyone knew they had to keep their guard up. They couldn't afford to let their focus slip. The world they were in was dangerous, and there were many unknowns. Tarnok's faction wasn't the only threat. They still had to contend with the harsh environment, wild animals, and the constant struggle for survival. That night, as Jack sat by the fire again, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The unknown noise had been a reminder that they were not safe. It wasn't just the outside threats they had to worry about. It was the growing sense of responsibility Jack felt. He was their leader now, and it wasn't just about surviving. It was about protecting the people who had come to trust him, especially Zara. She had been the one to see his potential when he hadn't even seen it in himself. She had believed in him when he had nothing to offer. And now, as they faced the possibility of more danger, he knew he couldn't let her down. Zara approached him again, her footsteps light and quiet. She sat down beside him, looking at the fire. The flames cast shadows across her face, making her look older than her years. She wasn't a child anymore. She had become someone Jack relied on, someone he trusted completely. "Do you think we're ready?" Zara asked softly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Jack didn't answer right away. He looked at her, his mind racing. The training, the plans, they were all important, but the true strength of the group wasn't in the weapons or the traps. It was in each other. It was in the bond they had formed, the trust they had built. "I don't know if we'll ever be fully ready," Jack said finally, "but we're stronger than we were yesterday. And as long as we keep working together, we'll keep getting stronger." Zara smiled, a quiet smile that spoke volumes. She believed in him, and Jack knew for the first time that he believed in himself too. Together they had come so far, and together they would face whatever came next. The night passed, quietly, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that their work was far from over. They had built something worth protecting, and no matter what threats they faced, they would fight for it. He looked at Zara, his partner, his friend, and knew that as long as they had each other, they would never give up. They would keep going, no matter what. And that was the most important thing. The settlement was quieter now. The people had worked hard, rebuilding what they could and strengthening their defenses. Jack, with Zara by his side, had led them through some of the most difficult times. But despite their progress, there was still an underlying tension in the air. They had survived the attack from Tarnok's faction, but everyone knew it wasn't over. They would need to be prepared for whatever came next. For Jack, each day felt like a new challenge. He had never wanted to be a leader, but the more he saw the group working together, the more he realized how important his role had become. Zara had always believed in him, but now he could see it in the others as well. They trusted him, and it made him feel like he couldn't let them down. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Jack stood on the edge of the settlement, looking out across the landscape. The land was harsh, but there was a beauty in its stillness. It reminded him of how far they had come. When they had first arrived, everything had seemed impossible. But now they had food, water, and shelter. They had hope. Jack knew that the future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that they might just be able to make it. Zara walked up behind him, her footsteps light in the sand. She had grown so much since the first day Jack had met her. She was no longer the shy girl who had watched him give his last meal to the children. Now she was strong, capable, and filled with a quiet determination. Jack could see that she was ready for whatever came next. They had both changed, shaped by the struggles they had faced and the bond they had formed. "You're thinking too much," Zara said, her voice calm but firm. "We've come a long way, but you can't keep carrying all the weight. We're all in this together." Jack turned to face her, his eyes filled with gratitude. Zara had always known how to remind him of the bigger picture. He wasn't alone in this, and that was something he had to keep reminding himself. They were a team. They were a community. And together, they had made it this far. "I know," Jack replied, his voice steady. "But sometimes, it feels like the future is always just out of reach. We've built something here, but I can't help wondering what's going to happen next." Zara smiled, a soft, understanding smile. "We've faced a lot, Jack, and we've made it through. Whatever comes, we'll handle it together." I believe in us." Her words gave him strength. He had always been hesitant, unsure of his ability to lead, but Zara's unwavering belief in him made all the difference. He had learned from her just as much as she had learned from him. They had become partners in this struggle, and neither of them would stop fighting for the future they had started to build. Later that day, the group gathered in the central area to discuss their next steps. Everyone had grown stronger over the past few months, and Jack could see the determination in their faces. They were no longer just trying to survive, they were trying to thrive. They had formed a new community, and they all had a part to play in shaping its future. Jack stood before them, his heart full as he looked at the faces of those who had come to rely on him. Zara stood beside him, her eyes watching him closely, her quiet strength a constant reminder of why they had made it this far. "We've all worked hard to get to this point," Jack began, his voice carrying across the group. "We've faced things no one should ever have to face. But we're still here, and we're stronger than we were yesterday. We have a chance to build something good, something that lasts." The group listened intently, and Jack could see that his words had an impact. He wasn't just speaking to them as a leader. He was speaking to them as someone who had shared in the struggle, someone who had stood side by side with them from the beginning. "We're not just surviving anymore," Jack continued. "We're growing. We're becoming something more, and we will face whatever comes together. As long as we have each other, there's nothing we can't do." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces filled with hope. Jack's words, simple as they were, had made them realize something important. They weren't alone. They had built a community, a family, out of the ashes of their former lives, and together, they would face whatever came next. That night, as the group gathered around the campfire, Jack felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt before. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky, and the group sat together, sharing stories and laughter. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living. They were learning to rebuild, to find joy in the small moments, and to protect the future they were creating. Zara sat next to Jack, her presence a constant reminder of how far they had come. She didn't need to say anything. They both understood. The settlement was stronger because of the trust they had in each other. They had faced the worst, and now they were learning to thrive. As the night wore on, Jack looked around at the people who had become his family. He knew that the future was still uncertain. There would always be challenges ahead. But for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. They had built something real, something worth fighting for. And no matter what came next, they would face it, together. The days had begun to feel more like a routine. The group worked together each day, bringing a new task, a new challenge, but also new signs of progress. The settlement, once a desperate place of survival, was slowly becoming something stronger. The shelters were sturdier, and the food stores, though not overflowing, were enough to keep everyone fed. Jack had come to appreciate the quiet moments, when he could look around and see the signs of life continuing. Zara was beside him as always, her quiet strength a constant presence. Over time, she had become more than just someone who helped organize the children and keep order. She was a symbol of the hope that had carried them all through the toughest times. People looked to her, just as much as they looked to Jack. The partnership between them had grown deeper, and Jack couldn't imagine doing this without her. One morning, after a long night of rain, Jack woke up to the sound of quiet chatter and the soft hum of activity. The rain had washed the dust from the air, leaving the world around them fresh and clean. The sky was clear, and the sun rose over the hills in the distance. The air smelled like earth and water, something Jack had almost forgotten the smell of. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, there was beauty to be found. Jack stood up from his makeshift bed and walked outside. Zara was already there, talking to a few of the others. giving them tasks for the day. As Jack approached, Zara turned toward him and gave him a small smile. "You're up early," she said, her eyes bright. Jack nodded. "I couldn't sleep. I just needed a moment to think." Zara's smile faded slightly as she regarded him. "What's on your mind?" Jack looked out over the settlement, watching the people work. "I don't know if I'm ready for what's next. We've come so far, but it feels like there's always something waiting around the corner. I don't want to lose what we've built." Zara stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We've come this far because we've all worked together. No one person is going to carry us through everything. We're in this together and we always will be. I believe in you, Jack. We all do." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Jack had come to trust Zara more than anyone else. She had been with him from the start, and her belief in him had kept him going even when he didn't believe in himself. They spent the day working alongside the others, reinforcing shelters, checking the food supplies and continuing to set up new defenses. The group had learned a lot about survival, and they were growing more self-sufficient with each passing day. But Jack knew that even with all they had accomplished, the outside world was still a dangerous place. They weren't completely safe, yet. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Jack was exhausted but satisfied. The group had worked hard, and though there was still much to be done, they had made real progress. Jack stood beside Zara, looking at the settlement as it began to come alive in the evening light. "We've built something," Jack said quietly, his voice filled with wonder. "Something real." Zara nodded. "We've built a future." Jack wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, he felt a sense of peace. They had created something out of nothing, something that was worth protecting. He didn't know what threats might still come their way, but he knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. The night fell, and the group gathered around the fire. There was laughter, conversation, and the quiet comfort of being together. For the first time since the crash, Jack felt like he wasn't just surviving anymore. They were living. They were building something that mattered, and that was enough. Zara sat next to Jack, her quiet presence a constant source of strength. The firelight danced in her eyes as she looked at him. "You're doing a great job," she said softly. Jack smiled, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." Zara leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice low but steady. "And you're doing it better than anyone else could. You've brought us this far, Jack, and we'll keep going as long as you're here." Jack didn't say anything at first. He just looked around at the faces of the people who had become his family. They were all here because of the choices they had made together. And though the future was still uncertain, Jack knew that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night air, and for a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to relax. The road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but they had made it this far, and they would keep going. Together. Jack turned to Zara, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Zara smiled and squeezed his hand. "We're in this together. Always." And in that moment, Jack knew she was right. They were in this together. The future was unknown, but as long as they had each other, they would face whatever came next. They had built something strong, something real, and that was worth fighting for. The stars above shone brightly, and the fire crackled in the background. As the group sat together, a family in a world full of uncertainty. The past had been filled with struggles, but the future was theirs to shape. And with each passing day, Jack knew that they would continue to grow stronger, not just as survivors, but as a community that would never give up.